Continuing Perek Gimel of Kuntres HaHispaalus, we're explaining in this Perek the difference between the excitement and the inspiration of the Nefesh HaTibis versus the Nefesh HaLakis, because we said that the main purpose of our Avodah is to not only have the Avodah of the Nefesh HaTibis, even though that's also important, but to be turned on also with our Nefesh HaLakis, and that's called serving Hashem with our soul, as opposed to only serving Hashem with our body, which would be the Nefesh HaTibis alone. And in order to understand the difference between these, we're going to now give an example of the way the neshama is in Gan Eden. V'hine, hadugma lahavin muchus hispailos hanefesh alakis b'hasagasa b'yesem ulubeshes b'hasagas hanefesh ativus. In order to understand, to help us find the experience, what is the real nature of this excitement and inspiration of the godly soul when it's understanding something, if, like we said previously, that either way, whether it's only the Nefesh HaTibis that's activated or the Nefesh HaLakis is activated, either way, it's coming through an understanding, through learning and study and thought that is happening in the physical mind. So it is melubash in the Nefesh HaTibis, in the understanding of the Nefesh HaTibis one way or the other. So how can I tell where the excitement is coming from and what is the difference between them? We can understand this a little bit by thinking about this idea that we find in Chazal, that it says that the souls enjoy the ray of the Shechina when they are in Gan Eden. Gam shahaneshamayis sham gam kim belevush denoiga, aval acher habirur, v'hu anikra levushi dakya, v'hu minoiga dechashmal debria oida yitzirachulu. Even though, so we're using this idea of the neshama, the way it's in Gan Eden, to try to conceptualize and imagine the neshama itself, the way it is higher than the body and higher than the physical world. But even though it's true that in Kabbalah it says that even there in Gan Eden, the soul does have some sort of a garment of naiga that allows it to have an identity, and it's understanding the Shechina through what it learned and the mitzvahs it did while it was in this world. But this is the levush of naiga after it's already completely refined. And this is called this pure garment, this refined garment. And this is naiga the way it's on the level of chashmal. Chashmal is the source of naiga when it's already refined, as opposed to when it becomes a klippa. And this can be on the level of bria or yitzira, depending on the person's level of their avaida in this world, whether they were understanding in a deeper way and they really had the kavana and the machshava behind it, that's the word of bria. And if they were doing serving Hashem with the natural midas, the natural love and fear, then that's on the level of yitzira, like it explains in Tanya and elsewhere. But either way, generally speaking, the neshama in Gan Eden is higher than the levush of naiga, so it's a good mashal, at least relative to the way it is when it's here in this world. Ukululim Eser Kaychesa, Rotzain, Vitainug, Vesechlu, Midas Kulu. And there in Gan Eden, the soul has all 10 of its kaychais. It has desire and pleasure, intellect, emotions, etc. Devadai ar hasaga shetasig hanefesh holakis for einig shemisaneges miziv holaki atzmai shebegan Eden he ba'a mitzad gili bechinas ar holaki shebeneshama zu kamay shehi beli helam etzimtzum klal. So certainly the soul, the way that it's appreciating and understanding godliness and the pleasure that it's happening from this ray, this revelation of godliness, is from the godliness itself in Gan Eden, and it's coming with as a godly light to the soul. Godliness is being revealed to it the way it is. It's not being concealed and contracted at all. Unlike when we're alive and we're in this world and we're only able to process godliness through our physical body. So here we have to look and see the physical things that were created and say, wow, look at the wisdom in the trees and in the plants and in the fruits and all these things, the animals, and the wisdom of my own body, how God makes it. And if I think about that, I can appreciate godliness indirectly from the way that it's expressed in the physical world. But there in Gan Eden, the soul is appreciating godliness the way it transcends the physical world. And this idea, this mashal, is brought in a slightly different way by the Rambam in his introduction to Perek HaChelek, where he introduces the Yud Gimel Ani Mamins, the Yud Gimel principles of our faith, the Yisaitis Amunah. And there he talks about the idea, he wants to understand the difference between the animal soul and the godly soul in his own words. And he talks about this idea how the soul, like the idea of Olam Haba, why it's important for us to have this concept to recognize that the soul has this connection to godliness that's higher than the body and higher than any physical needs. That we shouldn't think of godliness just in terms like in there it's very simply in terms of just eating or drinking that God's going to give us physical blessings, but we should appreciate that there's a higher connection that's intrinsic, that the soul just is able to appreciate and enjoy godliness for its own sake. And so clearly, the way the soul is appreciating godliness there is not based on what's the benefit it's getting to the body in the very simple sense, and it's not even understanding godliness through the perspective of the body or the physical world or time or space and all these kind of things. It's appreciating godliness it is, even though we're not really explaining right now what it is, but the idea is that we can at least have the concept of something that's beyond what we're knowing now, and that's at least part of the key to help us understanding is that it's something that's we're letting go of and transcending and going beyond all of the levushim that we know of this world. Al kain bevadai harei zeh bechinas elokus mamish rak shemeir al yidei hasaga elokis. And so certainly this is pure godliness. It's just shining through understanding, albeit a godly understanding, but it's really a godly thing itself. And the main idea of this, like Rambam brings out there, and what's being brought out here as well, is that this is an intrinsic thing. It's not that in the animal soul, it's appreciating godliness in terms of what it does for me in some sort of physical and self-centered way. And the godly appreciation of the neshama, like it is in Gan Eden, the soul doesn't have a body, so it doesn't need God to bless it with food and health and all these kind of things. Rather, it's just appreciating the thing itself because its essential nature is to love godliness, and that's a key thing of this idea that it's a godly thing. And so this godly understanding of the soul there is completely devoid and completely transcends any sort of yesh, any sort of concrete physical representation of it. It's just the thing itself. It's appreciating the godly source that's creating everything, as opposed to the thing that's being created. And like, for example, if you think about the difference, let's say a person goes and sees a painting that a painter made. So they are appreciating the product that was created, which is the yesh. While as the painter, they have the actual talent and they appreciate the skill and the talent and the ability, that creative ability they have to make anything that's the source of this painting or another painting. The same thing, let's say music. You can listen to an artist that composed a song and you like the song, but that's just the yesh, as opposed to the artist, they appreciate the inner talent and that is a creative force. And so that's in a similar way, we can appreciate godliness through what he creates, what God creates, which is the yesh, what we see in the world, or we can appreciate the actual godly ability behind it, which is the ayin halaki. Im kol zeh tikra hasaga, nevertheless, what the soul appreciates in Gan Eden is still called understanding. Al derech hasaga shetasik haneshama kan b'yis mulbeshes b'hasaga gashmis nefesh ativis belukus. It's still in some way similar to the way the soul is now when it's understanding godliness, when it's expressed through the physical understanding of the natural soul. So here we're using our intellect and we're understanding it with physical mashalim and physical terms and our physical experiences. And so it's obviously more limited and more physical, more yesh, but nevertheless, it's still an understanding and it has a certain comparison. V'gam ha'oineg alaki, and also the soul's enjoyment there of godliness is a godly enjoyment. Mushlo mikol b'chinas yesh, and it's totally devoid. It transcends any sort of yesh. It's not in terms of a physical thing. It's not a physical thing. V'seichel. I'm sorry. It's completely spiritual and completely godly. And again, the main characteristic of something that's godly is that it's intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic. and that it's a creative force as opposed to just receiving something. So like we are appreciating that God is giving us something, and the Nefesh Elokis is able to appreciate that it's able to appreciate these koiches itself as how I could use them to create and give and do something with it. Im kain gam bechinas hispailos b'hasoga lekis hazais yikra hispailos lekis. And so therefore the soul's excitement and inspiration that it gets from this understanding or this pleasure is also called a godly inspiration, a godly excitement. And it's coming from the godliness itself. It's not coming from something extrinsic from the physical world. It's coming from appreciating the thing itself, godliness itself. And the inspiration and excitement from the pleasure is godly pleasure. And so there's an example to understand the difference between a more physical pleasure where it's in this levush of noiga, it's focused on negation, something tangible, would be like physical pleasures, let's say money or food. And we're comparing that to a more spiritual pleasure of honor. That's more spiritual and it doesn't have to do with getting a particular physical thing. And so in a similar way, there's even beyond that, like Rambam there, he talks about in educating a child. First you say, learn and I'll give you candy and then give you clothes, give you money, give you honor. But the real thing is to do a lishma for its own sake, intrinsically. So this is the idea. We can appreciate that there are these different levels of divestment and transcending the physical. And therefore, once a person has the maturity to appreciate something more spiritual, like honor, we see people give up all their physical pleasures, and a lot of times somebody that's very rich gives up a lot of money and a lot of things in order to get this deeper pleasure. And in a similar way, the pleasure of honor is still physical compared to the godly pleasure of understanding godliness, even the way the soul is inside the body. So once a person has the maturity to appreciate and understand godliness, that is a much deeper and more spiritual pleasure than honor. And even the soul's understanding and pleasure in godliness, while it's manifest through the body, that is still more limited and more physical and tangible compared to the more pure and spiritual pleasure that the soul has when it's in Gan Eden. And so too, just like there are these different levels of pleasure, there's also different levels of understanding. Like you could imagine a very little kid you go and teach him 1 + 1 is 2. You have to give them a physical object, say 1 apple plus 1 apple is 2 apples, and then eventually they can understand something more abstract, that just 1 + 1 is 2, which is a much deeper, more general idea that can apply to anything, and you can go deeper and deeper beyond that as well. Okay, Yesh eser koiches b'neshama shenanes miziv eliki b'Gan Eden, and so too the soul in Gan Eden has all the 10 koiches, but they're all in this higher, more spiritual way that's devoid of the physical body and the physical world, and it's able to enjoy this godly light, this godly ray in Gan Eden, and has ratzon eliki, a godly desire, v'seichel eliki, a godly intellect, midas eliki, and godly midas chulu. And they're all from this perspective of the godly ayin. They're appreciating the abstract essence of the godliness as opposed to its particular manifestations. And because the godly soul, with all of its koiches, are a little piece of their little spark of godliness, they're like a spark that came from coal, and therefore the soul is literally a piece of godliness. Al Kain, or really a piece of God. Al Kain nanis miziv, therefore its intrinsic nature is to enjoy godliness because that's what it is. And so this is the whole idea of this deeper level, is that I'm not appreciating and connecting to God as something external to me, and I'm just doing what he tells me to do, and I feel proud that I'm able to be connected to someone as great as God, like a great king, but rather that this is who I am. And it's more like a parent to a child relationship where the as you grow up, you find that you really are the same essence of the parent. And so this is the idea that we're really a piece of God, and so therefore godliness is at our very core. And so therefore we have this innate godly pleasure and godly way of thinking, godly way of feeling. Um, and like it explains elsewhere, that this is the level of the Yechida that is just one with Hashem, like the Rashbi describes when talking about himself. There's a beautiful letter where the Rebbe is describing the difference in Likutei Deburim. The Frierdiker Rebbe talks about the difference between serving God with the mind and serving God with the heart. I don't remember if I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. That, and he says that Avodah Shabalev is in the heart and with the heart, and as opposed to Avodah Shabamayach is in the mind with the mind. And there, the Rebbe, somebody asked the Rebbe to explain this, and the Rebbe gives a mashal. Let's say there's a person that has a business, and there's somebody that opens up another business in competition to him. And so first, the person feels threatened that it's going to, maybe he's going to make less money because of this other person's business. And then he stops and he thinks about the fact that everything is decided by God, and how much money we can make was already decided on Rosh Hashanah, and so I'm not going to make one penny more or less than I'm supposed to the point where it doesn't bother him, he doesn't worry at all. He said that's all just still intellectual in the mind. But then you have another person where somebody comes and opens up a business in the same town, again, the same story. And here the person, because he feels for the other person, he knows what it's like to start a new business and how hard it is. And so he goes over, how can I help you? Let me show you the ropes. Let me get you started. And he actually helps him. And there's some stories of Hasidim doing things like this. And I've witnessed things like this. And this is called really having a heart. But the whole point is that this is a godly perspective. It's a completely different way of looking. That I'm not just thinking about myself and my needs, and my relationship to God is in terms of what He's going to give me. That's more like the Nefesh Tivis type of perspective. And this deeper perspective is that I'm looking to give and to contribute and to help. And so my whole value system of my midas is not based on just me. It's based on how can I give and how can I help somebody else. And I really feel for the other person. And so that's like a godly type of a midah, and a godly way of thinking. And the whole cheshbon is different. The whole calculation of what's going on is different, and the priority system is different, and it's all in a godly way. So I think that's a beautiful example that maybe we can experience in ourselves of that difference of when we're thinking about things just from a completely self-centered point of view, and God is in that equation that maybe helps us stretch beyond ourselves a little bit, but it's in an immature way where we're being forced to do it, as opposed to when we really find and uncover that God that's in ourselves, and we have this sincere desire to just, like Rambam describes, to want to know the truth because it's true and do what's right because it's right, and we're looking for opportunities in a creative outpouring, and that's the way it feels when the godly soul is alive and is awake and open. And so based on this example, we can also understand the qualitative difference of the godly soul itself versus the Nefesh Tivis. Even when the godly soul on the level of Bria comes down, the Neshama on the level of Bria, or the Ruach on the level of Yetzira, even when that godly soul comes down, belevush, the Nefesh Tivis, beguf, agashmi, and it comes into this garment of the natural soul, and it's being expressed through the natural soul that's in a physical body. And so everything is in terms, it has to come through my physical mind, my physical heart, my physical body. But still, shadayin nifsak mimena kayhu makar chaytzva hanikrat selim, it doesn't lose that innate quality of what it is that comes from its source. And this is what's called the tselem, the godly form, the tselem eliki that we have. This is the godly soul that we're made in the image of God. And it explains elsewhere that the tzaddik, lamed mem of the tselem, the tzaddik is the nefesh ruach neshama of the godly soul, the lamed is the chaya, and the mem is the yechida. And this is this deeper aspect of our soul that can come in and make us be in the image of God, and we're like this godly force just looking to spread truth and goodness, as opposed to just thinking about ourselves and our physical needs, or some manifestation of that, like desiring the reward of Olam Haba and things like that. V'chein mazla, this is also called the mazel of the neshama, the higher source of the neshama, that again is like this godly power that inspires a person in a deeper way, as is known. Be'in ach betzelem, like it explains elsewhere about this idea, ach betzelem is halach ish, that a person should go and be motivated in their life and guide their life from the level of their tzelem, from the godly perspective, as opposed to from the lower animal perspective. ומי שיש לו רוח דיצירה, מאיר בבחינת רוח זה שבגוף משרשי בבחינת רוח דיצירה, כמי שבגן עדן דיצירה כולו. So when a person is able to reveal the level of ruach of their nefesh kiss, this level of the godly soul is shining into their body, and it still is bringing with it some of that deeper consciousness, that deeper perspective of the soul, the way it was in Gan Eden of Yetzirah. Ukai Gavna b'neshama de Bria, and the same thing, the level of neshama of Bria of the godly soul comes in with this higher perspective of Bria or Nefesh Asiya, or even the lowest level of the Nefesh Lakis of Asiya still brings that godly level of the Gan Eden on the level of Asiya. Lefiza, and based on this, Hare Muvan al Kapanim, we understand at least somewhat, we have at least this framework, Sheyesh b'nefesh alukis, hamalubash b'nefesh ativis, gam keme'ein, v'oisa dugma b'espilus alukis, b'rotzim seif l'mida shaba, shu gam kem b'chinas alukus mamish. That when the godly soul, even though it's shining into the nefesh ativis, and it's coming through our physical mind, and it has to be expressed in the physical body, but nevertheless, it's coming with this qualitatively higher and different type of inspiration, which is a godly inspiration. It's a godly ratzon, a godly seichel, godly midas. Everything is elokus. Just like it was in Gan Eden, as much as that's able to shine into the body. Me'achar shenikra chelek alaika, because our godly soul is called a piece of God. Its essential nature is that it's a godly thing, and so its entire being and what's motivating it totally transcends the physical body and the physical world and those needs, and instead it's a completely intrinsic godly desire that it just wants to, again, do godly things, know the truth because it's true, do what's right because it's right, spread goodness, spread godliness just for its own sake. Gam sheyarda mata mata b'yeshua, even though it comes down very low. And also it's not really based on, it's not really coming from the seichel, from the cheshbon, it's just shining into it, like we'll see. But it's really like an emunah, an essential thing that's higher than a reason. The inyan hu she'ein ha'ar haluki sheba muster v'nelam kol kach kamay shemuster v'nelam b'nefesh denaiga. And the reason that this is so is because when the godly soul, even when it comes down, like it explains elsewhere, there's two ways that things can come through the hishtalish. It can come in a way of a ma'aver or in a way of a slapshus. It can come where it's just passing through, but it doesn't really change, or it can come where it really gets changed by each level. So when the godly soul comes down, it doesn't become so covered up and so concealed, unlike the nefesh ativis that also comes from the same source originally. And so everything comes from God, but as it goes through, it becomes completely, the godliness in it becomes completely hidden and concealed, and it becomes covered by this levush of naiga. Ki bechinas naiga be'etzem hi bechinas levush nifrad, kumai bechinas ha'aras ar hameir derech hamasach. Because the idea of the naiga, once something comes to that level of having this lavush of naiga or the clip of naiga, is that it's something that's now separate from the source. Like when you have light shining through a curtain where you're not able to see the source directly. So like if you have the sun shining through your window and the window is open, there's no curtain, you can look out the window and you can see the sun, you can see the source, you can see the essence of what is the light, where the light is coming from. And in contrast, if you have a curtain there, you get the benefit of the light, and you can imagine there must be some source behind it that's shining, but you don't know what it is because you're just seeing the effect of it on you, that it makes your room light and lets you see things, and it maybe gives you warmth and whatever it is. And so the same way, the nefesh ativis is only able to appreciate godliness indirectly. It says, I don't know what godliness is. It doesn't have the awareness of the essence of godliness. It just appreciates its effect on me, that God gives me life and gives me health and gives me wealth and gives me children and all these blessings. And so I can appreciate that, or I can appreciate how I feel good when I do a good thing or whatever it is. But it's all coming through this indirect lavush, like kind of like the child that's being motivated by extrinsic rewards, as opposed to the godly soul. It's able to appreciate and see the essence of godliness. That's like a person that's mature enough to appreciate that I want to learn just because I'm curious, and I have the maturity to see that that's in me. And so in a similar way, when we find this godly part of us that has these intrinsic godly desires, that's like we're seeing without the curtain. Okay, gamna shegam shu meir or gam kain. Even though when the light shines through the curtain, the light is still coming into your room. You're still getting light, and it's still the light of the sun. It's still like avo ene ar ha'atzmi. It's not the essential light in the sense that you can't see the source. Kiyim ar nikna. It's this. It's called an acquired light. It's like an induced light that now it shined. The sun hit the curtain, and then it bounced around, and it excited the particles in there, and now it gives off a different color and a different quality of light than the original light. Because now the light you're getting is only the light that was received from the sun is now shining through this curtain, and it's becoming the light of the curtain. And this is the relationship of this levush chashmal of naiga, is where we appreciate godliness in this indirect way, and we're not able to see the source. Masha enkein haneshama halakis b'sharsha mekabeles me'ar halaki ha'asi b'li halamelush. But the godly soul, it gets from its source, from the godly source, directly without coming through this curtain, and it's able to appreciate what godliness is, and experience that directly, and value that directly. And like one example of this is, again, like a person that is turned on and just have their innate curiosity, and they appreciate that, or they want to know just for the sake of knowing. And you're going to ask, so wait a minute, why does like we said, that the neshama even in Gan Eden has to have a levush of naiga? That's only this minimal amount, just so that it will not be completely nullified, and will be able to have somewhat of its own identity, but it doesn't get in the way at that point, like it explains elsewhere, that once the levush of naiga is completely refined, it becomes like a magnifying glass that actually reveals the light more as opposed to concealing it. So even when the godly soul shines into the garment of the nefesh hativis, it doesn't change its nature, it doesn't lose and forget what it is and who it is, and it doesn't change its nature. The lazais, just like, let's say, the teacher that's trying to motivate the kid by giving them prizes, but the teacher doesn't think that the candy is the main thing. They appreciate and they see that the main thing is the intrinsic value of the learning. They're just using that as a way to motivate. And therefore, the nature of the inspiration and the feeling of that inspiration of the godly soul, it doesn't change. It remains a completely godly, innate inspiration. And the inspiration of the nefesh hativis cannot be compared to it at all. Kamaishi Zbarlik will explain the difference between them more detailed. It's in completely different quality from the nefesh hativis, from the natural soul. It was just being expressed there, but that's not really what it is. And there's a beautiful story that they give. It's a mashal that relates to this. They usually say this as a mashal to understand what it means that the Alter Rebbe, it says, was a new neshama. The Baal Shem Tov said that he had a new neshama, but it relates to a similar thing here to understand this idea that because the idea of a new neshama is that it's a soul, it's a neshama v'yichida, as opposed to a neshama that's coming down through these lower levels. And so the example they give, I'll just say it briefly, is that there was back in the days when there were these landowners, parrots, and they basically owned everybody that lived on their lands. And if they would make them pay taxes and rent and whatever. If they didn't pay, they could do whatever they wanted to them. They were like a little prince over their province. And so there was a family who couldn't pay the rent. They got thrown into a dungeon, and nobody came to redeem them. And they just kind of forgot about them. And every day the guards would throw some food down, and they just lived there. And then, there were a few families there, and eventually they had children that were born in the pit. And so these children never saw the outside world. And eventually the original people died, and there were generations of people that were just born in this dungeon, and they never knew the outside world. They just heard stories about it. They had these traditions they passed down from generation to generation about the sun and the moon and the grass and the trees and all these things. And they used to tell these stories. And then one day a debate broke out, and people said, oh, these stories are not true. and it made things more exciting because now people would debate each other. Do they believe it and not believe it? And you had two groups in the pit, the believers and the non-believers. And then one day, the dungeon opened up, the pit opened up, and instead of food coming down, a person came down, and it was another person that couldn't pay their rent, and they were thrown down there. And now everybody gathered around. They asked him to tell the stories, and he retold all the stories, and a lot of non-believers became believers. And now there were three types of people in the pit. There were the believers, there were the non-believers, and then there was this person who really knew because he experienced it directly. And so there's a number of things that we see in that story. I believe the Rebbe spoke about it. That first of all, you see that everybody came to ask the person, is it true? Both the believers and the non-believers, because even the believers, they didn't really know it. They just believed it was this. It was just these stories they were told. They were imagining it. They're trying to envision it, but they had no idea what it was. And so this is a similar way. The Nefesh HaTivis doesn't directly see godliness, so it tries to imagine it, and it appreciates it indirectly, and it can appreciate the idea that okay, it's going to be good for me, and so it's worthwhile giving things up for godliness. But it's really doesn't know what it is, and it can't really appreciate it. As opposed to the godly soul, that even when it's thrown into the pit, even when it comes down to this world, the pit represents this world. Even when it comes down here, it doesn't lose its nature because it experienced it. It still knows what it is. And so it's a completely different thing. Okay, and now, yesh lahavan hefesh shebein hispalus nefesh elokis ba'asaga zu atzma shetasig nefesh HaTivis chulu. So now that we have this introduction and we understand the difference between the godly soul, the way it's in Gan Eden, versus the nefesh HaTivis, we can understand how when a person is doing a hisbeinus, even though it's being done in the nefesh HaTivis, that when the godly soul is what's being inspired and turned on, it's completely different nature. Because, like we explained previously, we described that when the Nefesh HaTivis hears some concept in Chassidus, when it first hears it, it doesn't get inspired right away. And it has to process it and translate it and figure out what does this mean to me. And afterwards, through effort, the person is able to translate this into something that they can imagine it and they can relate it to themselves. Then mispal me'akitzer they'll get inspired from just the summary from the Bechain, because you need some way to translate it because you don't know what it is directly. And again, there's this story about this there was a person who was a teacher in a little town, and one day a letter came for somebody in the town, and it was in Hebrew, and the town person didn't know Hebrew, so he translated it for him, and it said that this person's father, the other person in the town, simple person, that his father passed away. And so when this teacher was reading the letter, the simple person fainted when he heard this. And so the question is, why didn't the teacher, he understood it better, he had more intellectual, philosophical, technical understanding of the language and the words and everything, but it wasn't his father. So this is the idea that if you don't have that innate connection to something, then you could hear the same words and understand it technically from a technical standpoint, all the information and the philosophy of it, but you're not necessarily seeing the godliness of it, and it takes work to apply the godliness to yourself. So this is one of the signs. If already 1 or 2 moments passed and the person is not inspired and moved from the idea itself, that is a sign that shows that the godliness of this understanding is very hidden from him, that he's not seeing the godliness of it, he's just seeing the intellect of it. So all he has is what the intellect hears, the intellectual side of it. And that's just a theory, it's a philosophy, and it doesn't relate to him personally. Because the godliness of this understanding is very distant from him. Until only later, once he exerts himself. And by the way, this is the idea of Asik HaTorah, the Rebbe says, as opposed to Limud HaTorah, like in Pirkei Avos, different places. Chazal, they speak about Asik HaTorah, about toiling in Torah. This is the idea that a person has to work to make it personal and relate it to themselves, so it'll really change us and really affect us, as opposed to just knowing it intellectually as information. So it takes this effort, and this is what we call avoda, is this effort to really find how it's personal to me and relates to me, and then a little bit of the light will shine into him and inspire him. And it's just what they said before, the bechein, or just the little kitzer of the idea and the essence of it, the distilled essence. Shemispal b'hayda kanal, like we said, the person will be inspired, whatever level it is, maybe just in a way of admitting that it's true and feeling it. V'gam ze b'richuk or ha'etzem me'achar shaba haspayis b'lashen b'chein kanal. But even the hayda that they have, that it turns on their emunah, it's in a distant, detached way, because it's coming, and like you see, a lot of times people's emunah, it comes through this like imagination, basically, and that's, it's with lacking direct experience. And so therefore it's somewhat distant. וגם כאשר מספול מגופה של ההשגה עצמה במחשבה הנקרא מחשבה טובה כנ"ל, and even when the person gets more inspired more directly from the idea, which we said is a good thought, the level of ruach, עד בחינס הכוונה עצמה, all the way up to the level of, like we said, the level of neshama, or the level of chaya, even from the kavanah itself, which is called the intellectual love and fear, but nefesh hativis, if this is still within the nefesh hativis, in the natural soul, shu espailos min ha'etzem, they're actually inspired from the essence of it, and not just from the bechein, just the application, the implication of the idea as opposed to the idea itself. Ella miyaj yasig hasoga mitzan atzma mispal, even if the person's on that level, where as soon as they understand the idea itself, they get inspired. Ve'ein haspayis nifredes klam and etzma musakulu. Their inspiration is not separate from the idea itself. So that shows, like we said, as the person climbs the ladder from nefesh to ruach, neshama, chaya, yichida, within nefesh hativis, also the godliness is more and more revealed to them. But mikol makim hakol hu bebechinas elokus hamuster belevush denaiga. But as long as it's the nefesh hativis, so a person can get to the point where they're really passionate about, they're like a geek for Hasidus, like a person would be very into whatever physics or mathematics or some other type of subject, that they appreciate the topic itself, but it's still coming through the intellect. They really appreciate the intellect of it, and it's kind of stuck somewhat in that levush. Ubefrat ba'soga de bina sheben nefesh zu denaiga chulu, and specifically, it's being trapped and limited and concealed through this levush of the understanding that it's based on some sort of logical thing as opposed to the thing itself. Asher ein laze erech klal b'chinas ar haluki ha'atzmi shemeir bebina v'hasaga de nefesh lekis hamalubash b'hasaga zu atzma shenefesh hativis maseges. And you can't compare this indirect appreciation that's based on some line of reasoning as opposed to the nefesh lekis, which sees the godly light itself that's shining into this understanding, that's the source of the understanding. It's like if you could give an explanation to try to describe something to somebody, but if something that you personally experience, like let's say a person that witnessed being by a forbidden of the Rebbe, and they're trying to describe what that's like, so they know the essence, and they're giving explanations as a lavush for it, but their inspiration is not coming from the explanation. They're just trying to capture it and convey it. Like, if you want to tell somebody how much you love them, or you want to give them flowers or give them a present, you're taking something that's really deeper and essential and beyond expression, and you're trying to find a way to express it, as opposed to where a person is at a lower maturity and they just appreciate the value of the physical gift itself. Like I remember when I was a little kid, I had relatives I go to and I visit them, they give me $1, and I appreciated the dollar more than the relationship probably at that age. And then when I get them now, I'm embarrassed of it because the person's obviously worth much more than the dollar. So that's like the difference. That the nefesh hativis is always getting its appreciation of godliness through this indirect way. Vasaga the nefesh lekis hamalubash vasaga zu atzma the nefesh hativis shenefesh hativis masega sheyesh ba me'ein oisei ar leki ha'atzmi shebasaga the bina the nefesh lekis kishanen is miziv haleki ha'atzmi shebaganein kana b'li masak halam klal. And so the nefesh lekis, even though it's thinking the same word, learning the same mimer, but its seeing the essential godliness and it's appreciating it in a similar way, a me'ain, a taste of the way it has it in Gan Eden, which is completely without any levush at all. V'lozois gam haspilus shebahasaga zu de nefshel kis tikra b'shem hispilus alakus mamish. And therefore, when the godly soul, even though it's thinking the same as blindness, learning the same thing, but it's called a godly inspiration. It's not being inspired by something that's separate from godliness, that the godliness is coming into being expressed through. Unlike the inspiration of the natural soul in the understanding, where it's saying, wow, look, maybe look how at the wisdom that God has in creation, but it's not appreciating the godliness, it's appreciating the effect of it that it's able to see and appreciate in the world. And this is the main difference between them, that even though they could be understanding the same idea, but qualitatively it's a completely different level of maturity. And this is, again, very similar to Rambam's description of, you could have, a kid that's very excited that they worked hard, let's say, and learned something, and they got an A and they're excited because they're going to get a prize for it or whatever, as opposed to the parent or the teacher that's excited because of what they did, not because that they're going to get something for it, but because they see that, look, there's an intrinsic value to the fact that they're developing their potential and they're developing their curiosity and their ability to learn. And so they're looking at the same thing and they're excited about it for very different reasons. So the kid has to filter their excitement through this extrinsic reason of, I'm getting something for it, or at the very least, the fact that they got the A, the grade, which is an external expression of the fact they did well, as opposed to just appreciating the accomplishment for itself. They need that something to externalize it and as a lavush. Okay, let's stop here.